The year was 2022. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi released 8 Namibian cheetahs into the Kuno National Park in the state of Madhya Pradesh. The moment was captured and discussed widely. For many, especially those passionate about wildlife conservation, this milestone was special. After all, it was a long wait, almost 70 years. Cheetahs in India were declared extinct in 1952. And in 2022 came the moment when India's Project Cheetah saw success. But this translocation or the return of cheetahs to India didn't happen overnight. It involved years of court cases, government permissions, deliberations, agreements, disagreements, and diplomacy. A new book takes us inside that last bit, a first-hand account of how things unfolded behind the scenes. It's called Bringing the Cheetah Back to India, How Diplomacy Made Conservation's Big Mission Possible. It is written by Prashant Agrawal and published by Hachette India. Mr. Agrawal is a senior diplomat who was posted as India's High Commissioner to Namibia in 2018. He played a critical role in the negotiations that eventually brought the cheetahs back to India. Currently, he is posted as Additional Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi. We got a chance to speak to Prashant Agrawal on the challenges of this complex project, the criticism that Project Cheetah faced, and much more. It's an insightful conversation that you should not miss. Hello and welcome, I'm Shubham Chauhan. Let's get started. There has been criticism of Project Cheetah. As someone who was literally in the thick of things, how would you respond to these charges?
Obviously, it's a challenging project. It's a complex project. So its success is not to be measured in 2-3 years, but I think you have to look at a much longer time frame of 15, 20, 25 years.
How would you describe the significance and the importance of this project for a common man who would turn around and say, look, what's the big deal in getting cheetahs back to India?
Just like, the other riches that we lost during the colonial times, is just one example. To us, I think an apex species, the return of an apex species is absolutely similar to that. I think I was completely struck by, and I was actually humbled by just the amount of affection, the amount of fascination, the amount of interest that the people of India have in their natural heritage. To us, I think an apex species, the return of an apex species is absolutely similar to that. So it's something that is very precious and something that we should be treasuring actually.
So thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking with me here on HW News. Firstly, congratulations on your book. I think it's a riveting book for not just those passionate about wildlife conservation, but someone wanting to know how the system works behind the scenes, how diplomacy works, how negotiations happen when it comes to two governments, of two different countries. Let's start by let's start with the book itself. And can you walk us through how this book came about and your process of putting together this book of a rather complex project that's been in the making for decades now?
Yeah, hello Shubham, it's lovely to be with you today. And as you mentioned, this book, Bringing the Cheetah Back to India, How Diplomacy Made Conservation's Big Mission Possible, has been recently published by Hachette India. And it is, fascinating. It's a thrilling first-person account of how Project Cheetah actually happened. So Project Cheetah also has the distinction of the world's first intercontinental translocation of a major species, by which we got the cheetah back to India after its disappearance for more than 7 decades. So it's a very special project, and it's a true story of how diplomacy and conservation work hand in hand. It's a story of the whole of the government approach. Starting right from the top, from the vision and the leadership of our Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, and, the whole of the government, several ministries, organizations, state government working together to actually realize this project, which has been in the making for several decades. So it's a true inside story, which I'm sure the readers and your viewers will enjoy.
Right, and for the viewers, just for their context, it's not some thick book that has a lot of theory. It takes straight into the action and describes the action, like I said, from someone who was in the middle, in the thick of the action. So you write that bringing the cheetah back to India is like a civilizational obligation for India, and it's almost akin to getting the Kohinoor back. How would you describe the significance and the importance of this project for a common man who would turn around and say, look, what's the big deal in getting cheetahs back to India?
True. So, as your viewers would probably know, that cheetah is the only, big species that India has ever lost. We are very fortunate to have, several large carnivores present in India's ecosystem, the lion, the tigers, the snow leopards, and so on. But cheetah is the only one which we lost, which was officially declared extinct in 1952. And it was a very large part, it was a result of the colonial practices of, overhunting and, degradation of our, their natural habitat. So, as we were celebrating, 75 years of our independence, I think it was a very, apt act to reverse a consequence of colonialism. And I have always been, very fond of also looking at it as a civilizational perspective, almost a moral obligation for Indians, because, Indian civilizational ethos has always been of, a very harmonious coexistence, with our fellow sentient beings. And I think it is a highlight and a high point of our civilization. So I have always felt that this gap, this void which was created in our ecosystem, we were able to sort of plug it, and I think it's something that we had to do. And just like the other riches that we lost during the colonial times, Kohinoor is just one example. To us, I think an apex species, the return of an apex species is absolutely similar to that. So it's something that is very precious and something that we should be treasuring, actually.
Absolutely. Let me get to one of the sort of main characters of this book, so to say, one of the many, in fact. It's the CCF and Dr. Laurie Marker. You've written very simply, very beautifully, what this project meant to CCF and Dr. Laurie Marker. For our viewers, can you just give a sneak peek and explain the importance of what CCF is, what it did, and the contribution of Dr. Laurie Marker?
Yes, I think, for your viewers, I would like to explain that CCF, it stands for Cheetah Conservation Fund, is a wonderful organization which has been based in Namibia. It is, situated right in the heart of what we call the cheetah, territory in Namibia, in the central Namibia. And it is led by a very remarkable lady, Dr. Laurie Marker, who has been associated with conservation of cheetah for a very long time. And not only they have very successfully rewilded and rehabilitated more than 600 cheetahs, which is a phenomenal feat, but they also do, remarkable research. So, they have a state-of-the-art genetics laboratory, which has also helped us, in the project. They also have several projects like the lifeguard breeding programs. But most importantly, they have been our technical partners in the project, advising, guiding us, not only through the translocation process, but they have also been associated in the later part. So they have played a very important role in the whole project.
Right. Now, this is one of my sort of favorite moments. It's an anecdote I liked. Your meeting with the Namibian president, which you described, it was almost broadcast on live TV. What was going through your mind as you brought up this topic of the cheetahs in front of the president, especially when the entire press was just there capturing this meeting and it was being broadcast? What was running through your mind? And can you tell us what happened in that meeting when you brought that topic up?
So, I invite your readers to read about the whole episode in the book, of course, but to give you the background in a nutshell. So, when we decided to call on President Gengo, the late Dr. Hage Gengo, he's no longer with us today. It was a calculated risk which we took because, we had been working very hard on the ground, to shape public opinion, to build trust between the two governments, and, create a sort of a favorable climate to look at this project, that this is something which was very important in the world of conservation, and India was approaching it in a very scientific way, with great study and a lot of preparation, and there was a great amount of political will and seriousness to do this project. Now, we were also mindful of the fact that about 10 years ago to that, in 2012 around, I think Namibia had actually, refused to, to accede to our first such request. And obviously things had changed since then in India. There was change of leadership, and President Hage Geingob was one such person, who belonged to that leadership of Namibia, which had seen up close and personal, India's, very, strong contribution to their own, independent movement. Of course, President Geingob had also visited India in 2015 for the India-Africa Forum Summit. So it was a calculated risk because we were preparing ground. We were still waiting for a formal green light from the Namibian government that yes, project can go ahead and we'll give you a few cheetahs. So, our thinking was that if we get, a sort of a blessing or a nod or a concurrence from the topmost leadership, I think it'll sort of, make rest of the system and, get attuned to what the leadership thinking was. So with that perspective, we decided that we will sort of, go ahead and broach it right at the very top. And to our immense pleasant surprise and satisfaction, when we raised it with President Geingob, we actually sort of said that, yes, we'll be happy to do this for India. And obviously, the necessary procedures and processes have to be undertaken, which was absolutely the case. I mean, there were a lot of national requirements on part of Namibia. There were a lot of national requirements on part of India. And there were international requirements because both the countries are signatories to CITES. So that had to be undertaken, but it was important to get the political leadership on board. And our meeting with President Geingob actually was a very, very important part of that.
Right. If I can ask you a very candid question, as diplomats, of course, you are trained to be in difficult situations, to negotiate and discuss a lot of aspects. But throughout this entire process of negotiation, agreement, disagreement, you've in fact written how at one point you were quite angry during a meeting when some agreements did not sort of work out and there was a little back and forth going on. Was there any moment where you as a diplomat thought, okay, maybe this project will not succeed in my tenure till such time I'm in Namibia? You think, did that thought ever cross your mind?
No, I must say that I think our Namibian colleagues were all wonderful. I think they were, it was a real pleasure to work with them. And I think we were all being mindful of the fact that we were doing it for the first time. So there were no precedents. Normally, in our line of work, if you have precedents, then it helps, light up your path as to what has been done in the past. So we were doing something for the first time. And in my book, I have written a little bit about, how our approaches to conservation can be different. So, Namibia follows a community-based conservation process, and they obviously also, follow something what they call a sustainable consumption of wildlife. Whereas in India, we don't have that concept at all. For us, it's a very holistic approach, which stems from, our sort of civilizational take on what it means to have, our natural heritage with us. So there were just these two different kind of approaches, and as diplomats, it's our job to, smoothen, these, little differences, the subtleties. So it was obviously, something that we were doing. And obviously there were moments where differences did seem insurmountable, but eventually, through trust, mutual trust, through mutual collaboration, we were able to achieve what we both wanted to.
Right. And you write that there were different challenges coming outside of what was happening. There's, of course, the big pandemic that threw a spanner in the works in a way where you had to adjust to that and then sort of go ahead. You mentioned that there was a point of difference between India and Namibia when it came to the MOU. There was one particular clause Can you simplify what that point of difference was? You touched upon it briefly in your answer. Can you simplify it to help us understand why was it so contentious and how eventually that was worked around by the two sides?
Yeah, so in fact, I just made a mention of that. So I will not be able to go into too much of the nitty-gritty of what it was about. But I think broadly, I think the point was emanating from these two very different approaches to conservation. And the challenge was really to sort of, marry these two approaches and, come up with a solution, come up with an MOU which was workable for both of us. And yeah, we were very clear that the Project Cheetah didn't mean just sort of exchange of some cats. I think the idea has been to work much more on a broader plane, in terms of capacity building, in terms of sharing of best practices. So in fact, after Project Cheetah, again under the leadership of our Prime Minister, India has actually started a wonderful initiative called the International Big Cat Alliance. So it's a holistic approach to conservation which we were trying to achieve through this.
Right. At the same time, there's been a lot of criticism that has come the way of India's Project Cheetahs. Many say that this was a vanity project. It was ecologically unsound. So there has been criticism of Project Cheetah. As someone who was literally in the thick of things and getting the cheetahs back to India, how would you respond to these charges?
Well, I think it is not for me to comment on policy. I think Government of India's policy is right there for everyone to sort of see and discuss and debate. And in fact, the whole point of this book is also to start some healthy conversations around these critical issues. And I'm very happy that is happening. But, as we said, and I think as our leadership is very fond of saying, and very correctly so, that, when you protect an apex species, for example, if you look at, the current places where cheetah is, Kuno National Park. So when you protect apex species, you are actually providing protection to the, entire landscape, the entire ecosystem around it. And that has actually been happening. So like if you even just look at Kuno National Park now, so you have sightings now of rare species which have never been seen there before. I mean, recently we had this, absolutely striking instance of caracals being spotted for the very first time, in Kuno. And Dhole, the wild dogs, and forest owlets, and so many other species. So, protecting an apex species actually, protects the whole ecosystem. And by ecosystem, we also mean, the communities who are living on the fringes of these, protected areas. So the tribals, the ecotourism part. So, I think the results are there for all to see. Obviously, it's a challenging project. It's a complex project. So its success is not to be measured in 2-3 years, but I think you have to look at a much longer time frame of 15, 20, 25 years. But, again, you have to see the remarkable success that the project has achieved in the just past 3.5 years. I mean, we today have 53 cheetahs, including, a remarkable number of cubs which are born in India. So there are some very resounding successes to speak.
As a diplomat, what was the one big learning curve or one big takeaway experience for you in this roller coaster journey? 2018 is what I think is when you went to Namibia. When you look back at that journey, what was that big learning lesson for you as a diplomat, and what is it that you will take away from this journey?
So, I think we were able to, once the Supreme Court gave the green light and, Government of India decided that we had to get this done, I think we were able to do everything in a relatively short time span, even though the project has been in the making for several decades, but there was no progress in the past few decades. But as the project happened and the day the cheetahs actually landed in India, I think I was completely struck by, and I was actually humbled by just the amount of affection, the amount of fascination, the amount of interest that the people of India have in their natural heritage. It is just mind-boggling, and it is, I think, something very unique and very special about us that we care so much. That was a big learning for me, that I think the people of India care for not just these animals, but for our natural world, our natural heritage. And therefore, I think it is part of our duties to do our bit to protect these ecosystems. And as I just mentioned, the idea of the book was actually to make our youngsters realize. I think the idea was to make our youngsters get interested in issues like diplomacy, in issues like conservation, and also start a healthy conversation around these issues. So that's how the book came out.
Absolutely. On that note, Prashant Agrawal, sir, thank you so much for joining us. To our viewers, this is the book one final time for you. You can, of course, find it online. You can find it in your nearest bookstore. But do make sure you read this because, like I said at the introduction, this book is not just about cheetahs. Of course, that is, of course, the theme, but it's also a sneak peek into how our diplomacy works. And that is an aspect that is absolutely fascinating. Besides, of course, the complex project Cheetah, and like Mr. Agrawal said, it's a long-term project that one needs to look at. But do get your hands on this book. Sir, thank you so much again for joining us on HW News. Thank you, sir.